order to ensure that an organization's projects are aligned with their strategy, project managers often want to understand on which category do their projects usually fall under. You see, we've got those strategic projects that are aimed at bringing value to your organization in the long run. We also have operational projects that are aimed at ensuring that the day-to-day processes can be improved. And we also have the compliance projects or the must-do projects. In understanding which category of a project would a particular project fall under would make it easier to select which type of project to pursue. So, for example, if a project falls under the compliance category, well, there's no question on whether or not we should do it or not, because if failure to do so can lead to potential fines or to potential issues that could represent significant problems for the company. If the project falls under the strategic category or the operation category, then it's a matter of looking at several factors. Now, one of the most commonly used project selection criteria is the payback model. Now, the payback model can be explained through this formula, where the payback period, usually measured in years, is equal to the initial investment over the annual net cash flows. Now, this is one of the most widely used models because of its simplicity. It essentially measures the time it will take to recover a project's investment, and it will use cash flows to determine how attractive a project is. Now, what we want to be looking at is a short payback period as opposed to a long payback period. Why? Because long payback periods are risky. So the longer it takes to recoup the investment, the more chances there are for things to go wrong that can affect us getting our investment back. Now, there are some limitations for the payback period. For example, it ignores the time value of money. It also assumes the cash flows for the investment period only, and it doesn't consider profitability. So although the a payback model is a good, widely used method, it should not be the only type of method. Now, let's do a short exercise, okay? So imagine that Tom Banks, who is the managing director for Unisoft, he has set a new project selection criteria, and that is to invest only in projects that will pay back in less than 4 years and whose average rate of return will be more than 15%. Now, his team presented 2 projects: the design and launch of a new software suite, which would cost 1.4 million with projected cash flows of 450,000 pounds per year for 5 years. Now, the second project was an updated release, which would cost 800,000 pounds with projected cash flows of 220,000 per year for 5 years. Now, using the payback period and the average rate of return formulas, which I have selected here for you, identified here for you, I want you to tell me which project should Unisoft pursue. So take a minute or two to make this calculation. Well, essentially, we need to input different variables into the formula. So for the first payback period, we would take the initial investment, right, which was here 1.4 million pounds, over the annual net cash flows. And we see that we've got annual net cash flows or projected cash flows of 450,000 pounds. So that is exactly what we have here, and that would give us a payback period of 3.11 years. Now, if for the second project, right, which was the updated release, we've got an initial fixed investment of 800,000 and projected cash flows of 220,000. So we input that into our payback period formula, which is this one right here, and that would give us a total of 3.64 years. Now, let's also do the average rate of return for these two different projects, and what we see is that we use exactly the same figures that we had before. We take the average return during the period, so 450 over 1.4 million investment. That would give us the average rate of return of 32.14%. Now for the second project, we again use those same figures, and we get that the average rate of return would be 27.15. So you may realize that it was a bit of a trick question because both projects actually fit the criteria. Remember, the criteria were that they paid less than 4 years. So both of them are paying, one is paying in 3.11 years, another one is paying in 3.64 years. So both of them satisfy this criteria. Now the other criteria was that the ARR will be no more than 15%, and as you would be more than 15%. And as we can see here, both ARR are higher than 15%. So both fit the criteria. However, one of these projects is more attractive than the other, right? The new software suite is more attractive because it has a shorter payback period, right? It has a shorter payback period, and also it has a greater average rate of return. So here it has a greater average rate of return. So if we use the payback model with this example using these formulas, we can understand that for the case of Tom Banks, that he should go for this project right here. He should go for the new software suite. Another example of a financial project selection criterion is the net present value approach. Now, the net present value will use the present value of all net cash flows, and what we want to look for are scenarios where the net present value is greater than 0. So if the net present value is a positive number, right, or greater than 0, that means that the project will meet the minimum return requirements. Now, what we need to be careful for is whenever we see a negative net present values, in such cases, they should trigger an alarm because it means that the required rate of return is not satisfying the minimal requirements. Now, here we also want to focus not just on when the net present value is positive, but we want to focus on those NPVs that have a higher rate of return. Right now, we need to be careful, however, because usually the projects that have a higher rate of return would also mean that they involve higher risks, right? The higher the risk, the higher the return. So again, what we're realizing is that although payback period, net present value can be useful project selection criterions, they should not be the only type of criterions that we use. Now let's see what happens when we apply the net present value formula to the previous example. What do you notice? Now, if we use the net present value formula with the previous example, we notice that again, our understanding was correct, that the first project or the new software suite would be more attractive because the net present value for the second project is a negative number, so it doesn't satisfy the NPV requirements. Now, in order to do this, we can use Excel, and this is again taking the examples of the information from the previous slide, the Tom Banks Unisoft Managing Director example. And what we do is that we set up a simple layout here. You don't always need to put all of the details, all of the figures here, especially because imagine if we want to do the NPVs for maybe 25 years, then it would be many different columns. But for the sake of understanding, I have laid it out here where we have the required rate of returns. We've got the different years of 1 to 5, and we've got the different cash flows for all those different years minus the investment. Now, what we need to understand is how to set up these formulas here, which were set up using the NPV formula. And if you input this information into an Excel worksheet, you should get the same results. Organizational leaders need to consider not only the financial selection criterion, but also look at non-financial selection criterion such as checklist models or multi-weighted scoring models. Now here we see an example of a checklist. Now there's no universal checklist for project selection. Usually organizations will create their own checklist of what they consider important over a period of time. But here we have an example of some of those questions that are likely to make all of these type of checklists. For example, first one would be, what is the organization's strategic objective that would align with this project? We could also ask questions like, who is going to be sponsoring this project? When it comes to risks, we don't only want to know what is the project risk or to our organization, so what are the risks of the project, but we want to ask, quite importantly, what is the impact of not doing this project? Now, just within this area, there's many different topics that would make sense to include in your checklist, right? So how is this project going to be measured in terms of success? What is the estimated cost of this project? How does the project interact with other projects? Do we have the right type of technology to get this done, etc.? Now, other type of questions that you might ask is, will this project help us increase our market share? Does this project help us develop our core competencies? How will this project affect our brand image and reputation? So there's many different types of questions that you may consider important to include in the type of checklist that you're creating, depending on the type of project, depending for the type of department that you work for within an organization. But overall, having a checklist model is a good complement to the financial selection criteria that we looked up a couple of slides ago. Another example of a non-financial criterion for project selection would be a multi-weighted scoring model. Now, this type of multi-weighted matrix is one of the most commonly used techniques in order to factor in multiple variables when you're making a decision. So let's have a look at how it works. So we would structure it where by placing projects down one column, and within each project there can be different categories. So for example, does the project stay within the core competences? How good is the strategic fit of the project? Is there any sense of urgency? And we can add as many other criteria as we consider applicable. Then we can give a weight to each criteria, a weight being with a value. In this case, we see values that range from 1 up to 3. And it's essentially how important is this criteria. And then when we take our projects, we can assign a grade. In this case, the grades are assigned between 1 and 10 of how does the project score within each of those criteria. Now, what we do after is that we multiply the grade that we give it, right, times that weight, and then we add it. Therefore, it's called a multi-weighted scoring model. Now, in this case, we see that out of all of the examples of projects that we have here, project 5 has the highest weighted total of 102. Now, this type of approach is, although we're using, let's say, a quantitative approach to it, it is a qualitative assessment in the sense that the grades cannot always be given with mathematical exactitude. So there is that element of subjectivity when you're using it. But nonetheless, it helps us sometimes to make a clearer sense when we've got maybe 8 different variables, 8 different criteria, and we don't know how each project will be ranked against the different criteria. Well, using a multi-weighted scoring model can help us make more sense and can help us make more structured decisions. At the end of the day, however, a good a project portfolio management team should be able to select a project not based on one criteria only. So you should use a combination of different criteria, both financial and non-financial, in order to decide what kind of projects should an organization pursue.